Hi, everybody. The title of my talk is Making Pluralism Practical with Quadratic Funding. I am Kevin Owocki, and I'm mostly known as the founder of Gitcoin, which is one of the larger quadratic funding experiments out there. How many of you have heard of quadratic funding? All right, just a pulse check, because Zoe just gave a talk about quadratic funding. And how many of you have heard of Gitcoin grants? All right, about half of y'all. So basically, the idea behind my talk is that if we develop tools, the right tools, open source forkable code, we can make pluralism practical. And I want to talk about some of the experiments that we have done with making pluralism practical at Gitcoin in my new company, Supermodular. Starting with Gitcoin grants, which in January 2019, we saw a need for a more scalable and democratic funding for the Ethereum ecosystem. And we had just read Radical Markets and the Quadratic Funding paper by Glenn Vitalik and Zoe. Put it into practice, and 3 years later, we've had 3,000 projects that have been funded via quadratic funding, over 15 rounds, and $73 million in results. So super proud of that. Thanks. All right. So basically, we've gone through an OODA loop where we are observing a need in the market. We are orienting ourselves, deciding what kind of mechanisms to deploy and acting on a quarterly basis. It's been 3 years and 12 quarters in which we've run 15 rounds of quadratic funding so far. And it's this iteration towards practical pluralism by just running through this OODA loop over and over and over again that we're learning to fine-tune the mechanism and how we approach making pluralism practical with the right tools. A couple other experiments that we've played with in the practical pluralism space. Quadraticvote.co is an easy way of doing a quadratic vote. And we've seen hundreds of quadratic votes hosted at quadraticvote.co. We ran a quadratic funding round in downtown Boulder, Colorado in the COVID pandemic. We saw businesses whose foot traffic had dropped 95% in the pandemic, and we deployed a $50,000 quadratic funding round in downtown Boulder, Colorado in 2020, and super proud to have left the blockchain niche and actually proved that quadratic funding works on Main Street, not just in Ethereum. Similarly, in 2021, we wanted to experiment with doing quadratic funding for mainstream open source software. So we partnered with Pia Mancini and the Open Collective and built a tool called Fund OSS, which was a successful quadratic funding round, did over 100K in results in quadratic funding for mainstream open source software. So again, proving with these separate code bases that with the right tools, pluralism is practical. After a couple years of experimentation, we saw a need to build a clean, well-documented code base to run fiat US dollar quadratic funding experiments. And so we're releasing a new tool in Q2 of 2023 called Simple Grants for Web 2, which will be a modular forkable tool that anyone can deploy quadratic funding in their local community. So again, taking the experiments, what we've learned in the OODA loop, and making pluralism practical. Alongside the Web 2 quadratic funding experiment, we have completely rewritten Gitcoin grants from the bottoms up to be decentralized in modular code base to run decentralized quadratic funding and quadratic voting campaigns. So now going from just the Ethereum community using quadratic funding to anyone who has an Ethereum-based network, whether you're a DAO or a DeFi project or an NFT project, being able to run quadratic funding. And that is launching over the next couple weeks in January 2023. Again, proving that with the right tools, pluralism is practical. So these are the experiments that we've run. I'm also really proud to be surrounded by a bunch of you, CLR Fund, Giveth, Polis, other people who are making pluralism practical with the right tools. Some ways that you can work with us, if you want to actually have data about quadratic funding and what it looks like and do mechanism design based off of that data, we're looking for collaborators. If you have a community that you want to run quadratic funding in, we've got a tool that allows you to do it without doing any software development, so look us up. Looking for data analysis help and the most promising places to run a quadratic funding campaign. So come find me if you're in either of those categories. We want to make pluralism practical, and we have a vision of taking the world to the quadratic lands, a place in which we have rewritten the laws of economics so that people can make a living by supporting the commons. So with your help, we will reach the quadratic lands and we will make pluralism practical. Thank you very much.